For nearly 200 years, we've been living in a world inhabited by machines. They are magnificent, obedient, and resilient, working for us day and night. But they need women and men to keep them going. And humans and machines are not made in the same way. The entire history of labor is imbued with this uneasy cohabitation between machines and humans. The story of a struggle between those who want to turn workers into perfectly integrated cogs in the mechanisms of production and these human cogs themselves, who try as best they can to maintain a minimum degree of physical and mental integrity. In a 1974 French documentary, Avec le son des autres, directed by Bruno Mouel, a car worker at the Peugeot factory in Sochaux talks about working on an assembly line.
Je suis rentré à 18 ans chez Peugeot en sortant de l'école. Je te dis, j'ai tellement mal aux mains, j'ai tellement des grosses mains, mes mains me dégoûtent tellement. Pourtant, je les aime tellement, mes mains. Je sens que je pourrais faire des trucs avec. Mais j'ai du mal à plier les doigts. J'ai un doigt, le gros, j'ai du mal à le bouger. J'ai du mal à toucher le minutes le soir, ça me fait mal aux mains. La gamine, quand je la change, je peux pas lui dégrafer ses boutons. Tu sais, t'as envie de pleurer dans ces coups de temps-là. C'est dur, la chaîne. Moi, maintenant, je peux plus y aller, j'ai la trouille d'y aller. C'est pas le manque de volonté, c'est la peur d'y aller.
His name is Christian Courrouge, and he worked at Peugeot his whole life.
C'est terrible, les souvenirs qu'ont les familles du travail en chaîne. Pourtant, les pères n'ont jamais raconté. Rares sont les enfants. Moi, beaucoup circulé, beaucoup fait les écoles. Et quand j'interrogeais les gamins sur la profession de leurs parents, ils travaillaient chez Peugeot. Mais oui, mais où? Ben alors là, c'est déjà l'ignorance. Et il fait quoi? Il raconte comment? Il raconte pas. Et c'est ça la chaîne aussi, de ne pas raconter parce qu'il n'y a rien à raconter. C'est pas un boulot noble, c'est pas un boulot valorisant. T'as pas envie de dire à ton fils ou à ta fille que t'as serré des boulons, que tu te demandes à quoi ça sert pendant toute une journée. Il n'y a rien à en dire. Et c'est ça le problème de la chaîne, c'est qu'à un moment donné, ça t'abîme le corps, ça t'abîme le cerveau, tu le sais, tu es conscient, et tu n'es pas capable de le transmettre à quelqu'un parce que il n'y a pratiquement rien de transmissible là-dedans. Il y a rien, c'est tellement pas valorisant. Tu vas pas dire, je vais laisser une trace. Quand tu es tourneur à l'usine, tu peux faire une quille quand tu t'en vas en retraite. Mais quand tu es en chaîne, qu'est-ce que tu vas montrer? Qu'est-ce que tu vas ramener de la boîte? Une poignée de vis pourries, un poste punition, t'as pas envie d'en parler. Et à part tes douleurs, tu transmets rien.
Christian Courrouge, nevertheless, brought home something from his life as an assembler, the pliers he used to staple the seat coverings.
Pour moi, c'est des tortures qui hantent encore mes nuits maintenant, je veux dire, cette pince. Voilà.
Mais pourtant, tu l'as gardé.
Ah, je l'ai gardé parce que je trouve toujours intéressant de garder un souvenir de ce qui t'a fait mal.
The upper middle classes have a different relationship to memory and transmission. As shown by the ostentatious tombs in the Glasgow necropolis, the cemetery for the city's well-off. Outside the entrance to the cemetery, among the statues of the city's great and good, is the figure of James White, Baron Overtoun, and owner of the largest chemical factory in Scotland. In 1899, a left-wing newspaper published a series of articles about the working conditions in this factory, whose toxic dust was so deadly that its workers were called White's Dead Men. Historian Arthur McIver.
I wish I could adequately describe a day's work so that my readers could fully understand the horrors. The men in the day shift go in to begin work at 6 in the morning. The vapours and fumes from the chemicals are all about them all the time, eating away the cartilage of the nose and poisoning the blood, so that the stomach in time will only contain certain kinds of food. In some cases, the men observed the hard piece of gristle when it came away while blowing the nose. The men examined how there was not an employee working inside in Mrs. White's, but as a chrome hole in the gristle partition of the nose. The majority of them could pass such an article as a common lead pencil right through the nose, from one side to the other. In some cases, workers reported to pay colleagues to masticate their food for them. Unfortunately, we know little about these workers in the aftermath of working in these kinds of conditions. Some of them lost their employment. We know they were thrown onto the poor law. Others were thrown on to the support of their families, disabled and maimed for life.
At the end of the 19th century, there was a new awareness of both the extent and cost of occupational accidents and illnesses. Up to that point, they were just considered inevitable, and only the Virgin Mary or a saint could protect an unlucky worker. Faith as a form of prevention, as seen in these extraordinary Italian ex votos. The most dramatic accidents were explosions in coal mines, which led to hundreds of casualties every time. The first statistics that were compiled show that industrial accidents cause tens of thousands of casualties every year. Germany and France voted in the first laws in the area of social protection. In response to defiant employers, the irrefutable argument was that protecting the workforce was vital, since they should be considered assets in the same way as the machinery. In the middle of the 19th century, steam engines became a standard. Through observation, scientists realized that they only produced as much energy as they consumed. The first law of thermodynamics was thus deduced and immediately applied to the workforce, who were considered as a sort of machine which needed to be fed and looked after, and renamed the human motor engine. Even more revolutionary was the discovery of worker fatigue. Up until the middle of the 19th century, it was simply considered as a moral defect due to laziness or unwillingness on the part of the worker. From 1880 onwards, new measuring equipment enabled the study in laboratories of how much physical resistance the human motor could exert before breaking down. Frémont, an assistant of French scientist Marais, had another innovative approach. He applied photographic analysis of movement to work in order to calculate the optimal trajectory of the hammer in the hands. This is Joseph Ponthus, interim worker in the food industry.
En fait, le geste efficace, c'est pas forcément le geste spectaculaire. C'est-à-dire que je vais prendre un exemple, c'est un truc tout bête, c'est décartonner des cartons. C'est-à-dire faire en sorte qu'une fois que le carton est ouvert, il soit ensuite plié pour aller sur la pile de cartons dépliés. On a un cutter, le carton est scotché sur le fond, et au départ, on tâtonne, on fait plein de trucs en essayant de tourner le carton dans tous les sens, et au bout de 6 heures de travail, on se rend compte qu'il suffit juste de faire tac, 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 pof, prendre le carton et le déplier ici. Et donc là, on a trouvé le geste juste, le geste efficace. Et on peut prendre un petit peu d'avance. Et dans ce temps-là, tac, 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 ça devient bon. La pensée, elle peut se libérer, elle est plus conditionnée par le geste à faire, parce que le geste a été trouvé. Donc ça peut être sur des cartons, ça peut être sur couper une queue de vache et remettre un carré pour accrocher le carré de vache à la place où il y avait la queue. Ça peut être sur tous les gestes que pousser des carcasses, Quand on a compris que pour prendre des virages, il valait mieux pousser avec le dos comme ça et les mains parce que le poids est moins dur. En fait, il faut trouver partout le geste de production le plus simple. Celui qui contraindra le moins le corps. Et généralement, le plus simple, c'est le plus efficace. Et à partir de ce moment-là, on gagne du temps et on peut penser à autre chose qu'à dire quel est le geste le plus efficace que je vais pouvoir trouver.
In order to study workers' movements, the American Gilbreth, who used both photography and film, came up with the idea of attaching light bulbs to their hands. Indifferent to the poetry of the movements, he drew practical conclusions in the name of improving productivity. Rather than that way, this way is better. It's quicker and more efficient, as proved by this special clock, designed by the inventor, which is always prominent in the foreground of films intended to sell the Gilbreth method to industrialists. Both Gilbreth and Fremont were searching for ways to optimize the workers' movements. But the human body had to adapt to this new way of doing things. This was why gymnastics for workers was introduced at the end of the 19th century, as healthy exercise and training for work, a cross between hygienics and productivism. These are miners in Donbass in the ex-Soviet Union, taking part in exercises in a film by Dziga Vertov from the late 1920s.
This is an interview with Tommy Coulter, a Scottish miner who started work in the pits in 1943. We interviewed Tommy in 2005. In this extract, he's talking initially about illnesses in the pit and the way in which the work contributed to such ill health.
Well, it was a known fact that the guys we knew, of course, is they stood at the welfare corner because they weren't fit to go to the pit any longer. But you would just see them at the corner coughing and spitting. You felt sorry for them and you knew it wouldn't happen to you. Just like soldiers getting killed, somebody else. You did, there was a very strong bond of sympathy, which wasn't expressed. He didn't say, oh, I'm sorry to see, you know, hey, you old cheeky bastard, what's wrong with you? That's how we spoke. That meant, hello, friend, how are you? Because I don't think there'd be anything worse than knowing you were ill and somebody commiserating with you. It wasn't that, we weren't that kind of people. We were the elite. And when you went to work in the coalface, we were strong lads. You had to be. We were hardy buggers, and we thought we were, I dare say something like soldiers.
That absolutely seeps through many of these male testimonies in heavy industries, in coal mining, shipbuilding, iron and steel and the like. The idea that you suppress your emotions, that you never cry, that you never express any real feelings. Perhaps in reality it was somewhat different, but certainly the narratives that come through in the oral testimonies is of suppressed emotion. And I think that was just part and parcel of this kind of traditional working class masculinity through much of the 20th century. It did damage workers' bodies. It did have a downside. These guys were taking on board risks, which I think were part and parcel of acting out or performing as a man. And whilst one wouldn't deny that management, employers are really the culprits, really responsible for the kinds of conditions that miners faced, still I think there was this male macho work culture that made it difficult for miners not to take risks. And in many cases was one factor in miners not protecting themselves as much as they might, using the mask, using the helmet, using the respirator and the like. And it's somewhat ironic that at the end of the day, these guys did damage their bodies as a consequence, both, I think, of managerial pressure, but also this prevailing peer pressure to act as men.
Women seemed to be absent from the world of work, and yet they were always present from the outset, in the cotton mills and in the mines. Underpaid, the first to be laid off in hard times, and demoted to menial jobs, not just by employers, but by their fellow workers too. Access to jobs in printing plants, for example, were forbidden to women by male workers, for whom feminizing the job meant demeaning it. Towards the end of the 19th century, female workers stepped into the limelight, thanks to a series of actions which caught the public's eye, such as the 1400 match girls of London, who went on strike in order to be able to negotiate directly with the management without having to go through the foreman, and also to have access to a canteen separate from the factory floor to avoid their food being contaminated by phosphorus. Similarly, in Italy, the first major strike of 1880 was not called by male workers in the Terni steelworks, but by the 1,300 female workers of the cotton mills of Centurini, renowned for their fighting spirit and this song. At the beginning of the 20th century, they constantly went on wildcat strikes and took violent action, to the dismay of the leaders of the Socialist Union. Historian Alessandro Portelli.
La discussione era sempre non avete dottrina, non avete disciplina, non avete dottrina. E le donne dicevano, ma perché non ce la spiegate la dottrina? Perché ve la tenete per voi? No? E anche l'idea che le donne che partecipavano a queste cose, quando dice la canzone, dice questa cosa straordinaria, se noi facciamo l'amore lo facciamo per scherzo, cioè una libertà anche sessuale, che spaventava moltissimo diciamo una dirigenza del movimento operaio che cercava la rispettabilità.
And it was women again who were at the head of the marches in Fressenville, in the north of France, during the strike at the Riquier hardware factory. Not having a red flag to wave, they used a French tricolor, but folded it in such a way that only the color red showed. Tricolor flag, red flag, a battle of the symbols. The tricolor embodies the French Republic, but also patriotism, which had become a real state religion. The red flag was the emblem of the workers' revolt, but also represented a class identity which crossed borders. It was the flag of the First International with its slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." Alongside these two great flags was the black flag of the anarchists, who were in a minority but extremely active.
Tu veux bâtir des cités idéales, détruis d'abord les monstruosités. Gouvernement, caserne, cathédrale, qui sont pour nous autant d'absurdités. Dès aujourd'hui, vivons le communisme, ne nous groupons que par affinité. Notre bonheur naîtra de l'altruisme, que nos désirs soient des réalités. Debout, debout, compagnons de misère, l'heure est venue, il faut nous révolter. Que le sang coule et rougisse la terre, mais que ce soit pour notre liberté.
The black flag was brandished in 1906 by a small union, who turned up at most conflicts, called the CGT. They were revolutionary anarchists at the time and fought in a pragmatic fashion for an 8-hour working day, while aiming to overthrow the whole system thanks to a new weapon, the general strike. Historian Marion Fontane.
La stratégie de la grève générale, c'est aussi une stratégie qui se développe sur la base du constat qu'il y a un certain nombre de choses qui n'ont pas marché. L'insurrection armée. La Commune a démontré que dans le cadre d'une insurrection armée, de toute façon, dans ces cas-là, la force revenait à l'armée de la bourgeoisie, si je reprends les termes de l'époque. C'est aussi une insatisfaction devant les formes de lutte que propagent les partis ouvriers, comme le Parti ouvrier de Jules Guesde, c'est-à-dire à la fois des grèves très sectorielles, mais aussi la lutte électorale et la compétition pour le pouvoir politique. Donc finalement, ce que veulent ces syndicalistes qui sont réunis dans la CGT, c'est ni l'insurrection armée, ni la lutte politique classique des partis marxistes. Ils veulent inventer leur propre forme de lutte qui ne les oblige pas à passer par un quelconque intermédiaire. L'idée, c'est que si le prolétariat fait la grève générale, il n'a besoin ni d'un parti, ni d'une organisation, ni quoi que ce soit. Il suffit, mais tout est évidemment dans le « il suffit », que l'ensemble des prolétaires s'arrêtent. Et donc, si les mines s'arrêtent, si les usines textiles s'arrêtent, si tout le monde s'arrête, tout le système s'arrête.
While waiting for the first general strike, France saw at the beginning of the 20th century a profusion of local conflicts, as witnessed by these remarkable postcards, which helped to promote conflicts by giving them a more positive image than the caricatural ones found in the bourgeois press. These staged photos, where all seems calm, do not do justice to the violence of the clashes. In this one, people are gathered around a dead horse belonging to the 21st Regiment, the force which charged the strikers. Faced with the strikes, the employers at the beginning of the 20th century refused negotiations. Instead, they used the lockout, an expression meaning that they would close the factory as a punishment to the workers. The workers responded, as in Fougères in the northwest of France during the big lockout of 1906, by inventing new forms of solidarity.
Dans un des frigos où on bosse, il y a une toute petite plante qui a poussé. Toute petite plante verte. C'est comme si comme si tu avais un petit renfoncement de mur là tout en haut, à 2 mètres de haut. Et tu peux la voir que si tu es dans une certaine position. Le frigo il est à 3 degrés et la plante verte elle a poussé comme ça. Alors je sais pas d'où elle est venue se nicher. Par où elle est machin. Et les gars ils la regardent avec tendresse, avec amour, tu sais, ils lui parlent de temps en temps. Moi aussi je veux dire ça va la plante et tout. Et il y a un mec qui fait putain, mais la plante, en fait, c'est une warrior, hein, parce que pour arriver à pousser dans un environnement comme ça, faut qu'elle en veuille, quoi. Et je fais, je fais, mais les gars, c'est nous les warriors. Elle est comme nous, la plante, hein. Voilà, on s'épanouit autant qu'une plante verte dans un frigo d'abattoir, quoi.
Flashback to 1871. It was the year of the Paris Commune, and the first recorded assembly line in the abattoirs of Chicago. But for the next 40 years, this novel system was ignored by industry in general and not taken up anywhere else outside abattoirs. For it to really take off, and with it all the other techniques of scientific management, it needed no less than industrial slaughter of a different kind on a world scale. War broke out on July 28, 1914. Even as late as the day before, militant workers thought they could prevent it by a general strike in the name of fraternity on behalf of the proletariat, not just in France, but in Germany as well. But in perfect symmetry, both German and French socialists rallied behind their warmongering governments in the name of the defense of the homeland and of their respective civilizations and of the struggle against the barbarity of the others. If we had called a general strike, said a CGT leader at the time, the working classes would not have let the forces of law and order shoot us. They would have done it themselves.
Ça donne une réponse à la grande question que se posaient la plupart des militants ouvriers un peu conscients avant 1914, c'est-à-dire qu'est-ce qui est le plus fort en cas de conflit? Est-ce que c'est l'appartenance sociale ou l'appartenance nationale? La plupart des militants ouvriers même savent que la question se pose. Quelqu'un comme Jaurès est obsédé par cette question. 1914 donne la réponse avec la plus effroyable clarté, la plus effroyable brutalité. En cas, et du moins sur le moment, durant l'été 1914, ce qui prime, c'est l'appartenance nationale. Pour le dire autrement, ce qui a gagné, si on prend le cas français mais ailleurs, c'est l'école républicaine, c'est l'armée, c'est 40-50 ans de nationalisation des masses. Ce qui a perdu, c'est la CGT et le Parti socialiste unifié.
The crowning glory of 150 years of industrial and technological revolution. This was the first war to use heavy artillery. Industrialization of the battlefield went hand in hand with militarization of the means of production. Rationalizing production, which was uncommon in Europe at the time, became a matter of state. Victory would go to whichever side produced more ammunition and more bombs the quickest. Women who took part in the war effort were afforded new legitimacy, as they were employed massively in arms factories to respond to demand. Likewise, the socialists and unions on both sides of the front lines turned into patriots and accepted to play the game of sacred national unity. But as the conflict dragged on, a brutal deterioration in both working and living conditions occurred. As early as 1915, strikes broke out again in all the countries at war. Not only in the factories, but in local neighborhoods, such as the huge rent strikes in Glasgow. But it was in Germany and Austria, where living conditions were particularly difficult due to the blockade, that the most serious strikes broke out in 1917. It was a far cry from the enthusiasm of August 1914.
C'est pour notre indépendance que l'on marche sans défaillance, comme si c'était le grand soir. Que l'on soit syndicaliste, anarcho, socialiste, tout chacun fait son devoir. Qu'on sache que dans la fournaise, nous chantons la Marseillaise, car dans ces terribles jours, on laisse l'international pour la victoire finale. On la chantera au retour.
The writer of this song, the French socialist Montaigne, was right. The International wouldn't be sung in France, but it was in Russia, where the revolution broke out in November 1917 and where power was seized by a party which claimed to be Marxist communist. And for the first time in history, they managed to hold on to power. One year later, almost to the day, as the Bolsheviks were celebrating the first anniversary of the revolution in Petrograd, another revolution broke out, this time in Germany. November 1918. The country had just surrendered. The empire had been overthrown and the Social Democratic Party had finally gained power. Historian Stefan Berger.
The German Social Democratic Party, as it developed before the First World War, was, in the words of Karl Kautsky, a revolutionary but not a revolution-making party. And yet, at the end of the First World War, you do have a revolution in Germany. It comes from a mutiny of sailors in Kiel, and it spreads very rapidly around Germany, where sailors' councils, soldiers' councils, workers' councils seize control at a moment in which the imperial German state is collapsing. The revolutionary agency is coming from below. It's not coming from above. The German Social Democratic Party has split in the war, so you have two Social Democratic parties. You have a right-wing Social Democratic Party and a left-wing Social Democratic Party. The left-wing Social Democrats had been opposed to the war. They are ideologically more committed to a more radical form of Marxism, whereas the right-wing Social Democrats are more reformist. And in 1918, power is handed to the right-wing Social Democrats by the last imperial German government. So Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the right-wing social democracy, he is the head of a revolution that he doesn't want. Because being made head of the government, in his eyes, he has already achieved power from above. He doesn't need the revolution from below.
The delicate balance between the two socialist factions lasted only 2 months. In January 1919, the far left, led by the Spartacus group, took up arms in order to pursue social revolution. President Ebert called on the old Imperial Army and the Freikorps, extreme right nationalist paramilitaries, to put down the uprising. The Spartacists were defeated, and their leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were assassinated. The same scenario was repeated a few months later in Munich, where the army and the Freikorps eliminated a short-lived Workers' Council Republic. And again, in 1920, when the last revolutionary attempt in Germany, the Ruhr Red Army, was also crushed. In a Dortmund cemetery, a discreet gravestone commemorates the 2,000 victims of the Red Ruhr Army. It was erected in 1926. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, the gravestone was saved from destruction by communist gravediggers, who had the bright idea of burying it until better days arrived. "We'll finish what you started," says the inscription framed by a hammer and sickle, the symbols of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which became the focal point of all revolutionary movements in Europe. Of all the victorious countries of the First World War, only Italy experienced a true revolutionary situation. In 1920, in the industrial north, in Genoa, Turin, and Milan, workers occupied factories under the protection of the armed Red Guards. Inspired by the Russian Revolution and the Soviet experience, revised and improved by the Marxist theoretician Gramsci, workers' councils sprung up. Like the one at the Fiat factory seen here occupying the office of the founder Agnelli, they took control of factories and offices and tried to kickstart production. Historian Stefano Musso.
E questi consigli di fabbrica, nella idea di Gramsci, avrebbero dovuto imparare a condurre la produzione in assenza del capitalista parassita, eventualmente in alleanza con i tecnici. Ma l'idea era che nelle fabbriche occupate si autogestiva la produzione E questo avviene per quello che si poteva fare, utilizzando le scorte di materie prime, di semilavorati che c'erano negli stabilimenti. Certo, non erano in grado di procurarsi nuove forniture dall'esterno, però si lavora, si produce in parte e questa occupazione finisce senza spargimento di sangue, senza conflitti armati, con gli operai che lasciano gli stabilimenti con le bandiere rosse e pensano che questa occupazione, anche se è finita, non fosse che il primo passo verso la rivoluzione. In realtà fu il canto del cigno del movimento rivoluzionario italiano, perché di lì a pochi mesi, nel 21, arrivò una crisi internazionale che si riflesse anche sulla situazione italiana e gli industriali iniziarono a licenziare e i lavoratori non furono in grado di opporre resistenza.
This is how the 1920 occupation was experienced by a worker in the Turney Steelworks.
Ed era un po' il reparto rosso dell'acciaieria, un gruppo molto numeroso che a metterci a disposizione ad occupare lo stabilimento, tanto è vero che un operaio di questo reparto buloreria, Zambella Alfredo, tanto è vero che io e lui proprio fummo quelli che portammo la bandiera della sezione socialista sull'acciaieria. Un paio di giorni prima la nascondemmo sotto al lettino dell'infermeria perché l'infermiere era un parente di questo Zambella Stecca e messammo sul pennone lì quella torretta che c'è all'ingresso dell'acciaieria con l'orologio e la bandiera rossa la mettemmo io e Zambella di notte, a mezzanotte.
La bandiera la nascondono prima dell'occupazione, la nascondono nell'infermeria perché l'infermiere è un parente del suo compagno, neanche un compagno politico. Quindi questo aspetto di questa grande lotta di massa, che è uno dei momenti epici del movimento operaio in Italia, a un livello, davvero mi viene da pensare al livello sotto il letto, no? La bandiera, è un livello proprio personale, di parentele, di amicizie. E il narratore Remo Righetti è uno dei protagonisti proprio della storia operaia ternana, antifascista, è uno dei fondatori del Partito Comunista, quindi insomma è una fortissima coscienza politica. Però quando te lo racconta non è la dimensione ideologica, è un evento nella propria vita, no? E poi naturalmente la conclusione del racconto è che è stato un errore abbandonare le fabbriche, no? Lì bisognava andare avanti, dicono, e fare la rivoluzione. Ovviamente non si poteva, c'è questa dimensione in cui c'è sempre questa idea che la ragione per cui non abbiamo vinto è che è colpa nostra, che non abbiamo lottato abbastanza, no? E questo nei racconti sull'occupazione delle fabbriche è molto presente, specie a Terni.
To combat the revolution, the Italian bosses called on Benito Mussolini's fascists, armed militias of the far right formed around a hard core of war veterans. The fascist program was simple: to abolish the class war by forcing capitalists and proletarians to work together. The fascists came to power in 1922 and immediately set about destroying the organization and the memory of the Italian workers' movement. But the Italian fascists weren't just an old-fashioned employer-run militia. Fascism introduced a new idea that had emerged during the Great War. Above all, things must not be halted. Total mobilization, as decreed during the war, also needed to be pursued in peacetime. It was a permanent state of emergency. The whole nation had to be mobilized for the good of the country, the party, and the leader. The traditional state only had a monopoly on violence. The fascist state added the control of politics, the economy, justice, the press, culture, community life, and sport. It controlled everything. The absolute state, which the fascists called totalitarian. In exchange, the regime built new stadiums for workers, like this one constructed in Terni in 1928. As a fascist thinker wrote, "In the total state, the nation have become athletes. As for salaries, they would be allowed to go up as soon as Italy regained its former imperial glory."
E questa è la promessa che il fascismo fa al mondo del lavoro. Dobbiamo pensare a rafforzare la nazione, che è la grande proletaria, contro le demoplutocrazie che erano la Francia, l'Inghilterra, gli Stati Uniti, chiamate demoplutocrazie, cioè false democrazie nelle quali in realtà domina la ricchezza, domina chi è ricco. No? Invece la grande proletaria, l'Italia, si muove, conquista l'impero, conquista il posto al sole e poi ci sarà benessere vero per tutti i lavoratori italiani. Finché i lavoratori fanno le richieste salariali, cosa volete che possano migliorare? Non migliorano le condizioni di vita veramente. Quindi niente scioperi, niente conflitti, lavorare e contribuire a testa bassa per rendere la nazione potente, e in questo modo si finisce ovviamente per fare gli interessi più dei datori di lavoro che non dei lavoratori dipendenti, perché si privilegia la continuità e l'efficienza della macchina produttiva.
In the 1920s, European workers in the big firms were confronted with a new enemy, scientific management, which came into play at the end of the First World War. It was called the American method, or Taylorism, after the names of its inventor, the American engineer Fred W. Taylor. As with most important inventions, Taylor started with a revelation. Working as a factory overseer at the end of the 19th century, he realized that the image of the disciplined worker who was proud of their work was a myth.
Well.
He noticed that workers made countless meaningless movements, surreptitiously slowing down the rhythm of work. They would even go so far as to disrupt, even sabotage machines, and arrange between themselves to do only the strict minimum. In other words, they imposed their own rhythm of work, despite what the management said or did. To control the workers who were slackers by nature, Taylor invented a strict separation between the conception of a job, the prerogative of the white-collared worker, and the execution of a job allocated to the blue-collars, who were expected to just carry out simple repetitive tasks with no excuse for wasting time or cogitating. The time allotted to those tasks was scientifically calculated. The law of the stopwatch, which imposed the same norms for everyone and prevented slackers from pointing the finger at over-eager workers. The Renault factory at Bolshevik, a mimeographed pamphlet from 1924, denounced this symbol of a hated system, the timekeeper like a vampire who sucked the blood of the worker.
You have booked your last book.
This is Taylorism seen through the eyes of a Soviet filmmaker from the 1930s. But the very same workers who took exception to the tyranny of the stopwatch in the factories were the same ones who went along to the stadiums to cheer on the exploits of their sporting heroes. The sporting achievements were recorded, a word made popular by Taylor. The performances of the workers as well were recorded, so that they could be surpassed.
Предполагалось, что у пролетариев нервы значительно крепче.
Back to life on the assembly line in the 1980s, at the Peugeot factory in Sochaux.
Il y a des mecs en chaîne, on n'en parle jamais, qui font pratiquement un marathon par jour, en distance. On avait foutu un podomètre à un mec qui emmenait des bagnoles sur un parc. Et il n'arrêtait pas de marcher en permanence. Et avec un podomètre, on s'est aperçu qu'il avait fait 40 km dans la journée. Et il faisait ça depuis des années. Et c'est quand même un exploit sportif bientôt. Et quand tu sors de ce genre de truc, tu n'as pas de temps pour te remettre, si tu veux. Moi, c'est toujours le problème, c'est que tu sors de chaîne, il est 10h, tu es fatigué, tu n'es pas réceptif intellectuellement, tu te fous sur un fauteuil et tu t'endors dans un fauteuil devant une télé bête. Et c'est ça le vrai danger. C'est comment que tu peux te ressortir après 8 heures de chaîne, qu'est-ce qui peut t'entraîner vers autre chose. Et c'est très compliqué. Plus tu vieillis, plus c'est compliqué. Plus la fatigue existe. Alors, on appelle ça l'aliénation, mais en même temps, il n'y a pas que ça, je veux dire. Qu'est-ce qu'on nous a tué dans le cerveau pour ne plus envie pour que l'envie de découvrir soit pas plus forte que ta fatigue à un moment donné physique. Ce qui devrait entraîner le reste devient, c'est terrible cette souffrance ouvrière, hein, je crois, ce manque de perspective fait qu'à un moment donné, tu t'endors doucement, tu ronronnes. Tu ronronnes avec tes fins, c'est ce qu'il y a de pire, hein, parce que tu ronronnes mal.
Finding the energy for something else. In 1926, Theo Godig, a skilled worker at the Krupp factory, was part of the night shift. He took advantage of this by taking his self-portrait with a timer in blatant violation of the factory's rules. The image, which became a symbol of working-class pride, appeared on the cover of the Arbeiter Fotograf newspaper, published by the worker photography movement whose subscribers ran into the thousands in Weimar, Germany. Just like the poet workers of the 19th century, these amateur photographers appropriated an activity that had initially been intended to enhance the leisure time of the ruling classes. It allowed them to take back control not just of their image, but also the ways of seeing things, which up to then were the reserve of avant-garde artists. But it was also a class weapon, enabling them to denounce poverty and particularly unemployment, which was a new scourge of workers in Europe. In 1932, here are the unemployed roaming the streets of Berlin in search of work, in the film by Bertolt Brecht and Zlatan Dudau called Kula Wampe, Who Owns the World? Germany was the country most severely affected by unemployment, with 6 million people out of work. The unemployed made up 80% of the members of the German Communist Party. But it was amongst them also that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, recruited. Whereas skilled workers who were still in employment were massively in favor of the Social Democratic Party, which above all had a legalistic approach. The German working class, which was considered the most advanced in Europe, was divided and desperate and unable to prevent Hitler from seizing power in 1933. Hitler, Germany's new leader, here visiting a Siemens factory. He claimed to be the most conservative revolutionary in the world. 40% of the members of his party were working class. April 30th, 1933. Women preparing banners the day before the huge Nazi celebration. Hitler, who loved muddying the waters, turned May 1st into a public holiday and the Day of National Labor. Historian Thomas Lindenberger.
Man muss sich das vorstellen, das war etwas, worauf Generationen von Arbeitern hingearbeitet haben. Seit Generationen sind sie am 1. Mai auf die Straße gegangen, sind dafür teilweise entlassen worden, haben sich Straßenschlachten mit der Polizei am 1. Mai geliefert, nur um diesen Feiertag zu begehen, haben sich dafür ihren Sonntagsanzug angezogen und so weiter und so fort. Und nun kommt eine neue Regierung und sagt so, 1. Mai, Staatsfeiertag, da wird die Arbeit geehrt. So wie Ley das dann später in seinen Reden auch ganz weit nach vorne gerückt hat. Ihr Arbeiter seid die edelsten, die wertvollsten Deutschen. Ihr steht eigentlich über den Unternehmern, den Konzernbossen und so weiter. Teil dieses Schachzugs war, am 2. Mai wurden alle Gewerkschaften verboten und die Gewerkschaftshäuser wurden beschlagnahmt und alle Gewerkschaftsmitglieder wurden in diese Deutsche Arbeitsfront eingegliedert, wo dann die Arbeiter und die Unternehmer zusammen in einer Massenorganisation waren. Es war also verbunden mit der kompletten Entmachtung der Arbeiterorganisationen selbst und auch der Konfiskation ihres gesamten Vermögens. Was sich dann in der Deutschen Arbeitsfront abgespielt hat, das waren teilweise sozialpolitische Angebote, die von einigen Arbeitern später dann auch durchaus gewürdigt wurden. Aber es war natürlich ein kompletter Verlust aller Mitbestimmungsrechte, aller Möglichkeiten der tatsächlichen Mitgestaltung dessen, was in der Fabrik selbst passiert. Es war Teil der Niederlage.
The first concentration camps opened in 1933. Thousands of communists, social democrats, and political opponents were imprisoned there. At the same time, the Nazi authorities, in fear of the workers, cozied up to them. They launched a program called The Beauty of Labor, which was supposed to spruce up factories and offices in order to create what the propaganda called happiness in the workplace. Sanitary facilities, canteens, and recreation areas were improved. Even more popular was the Strength Through Joy leisure program for workers. It was set up to organize mass tourism and operated long cruises which enabled thousands of the German working class to visit different European ports. The worker tourists were chaperoned by Gestapo officers, whose work was simplified by the fact that the cruise liners were confined spaces, much like factories or camps. Repression, surveillance, and denunciation were daily occurrences in the workplace, and there were no images of the few isolated acts of resistance. Except one, taken almost by chance during Hitler's visit to the port of Hamburg in 1936. Among the crowd of hundreds of workers making the Nazi salute is one man whose arms are resolutely folded. A single man, embodying working-class resistance amidst the collective disaster.